Welcome to the Motor Safety Association's presentation on summary offense tickets. This webinar presentation is based on MSA's interpretation of the summary offense ticket legislation. So a little bit about summary offense tickets. That's the reason why we're here today, to learn about them and how they affect you and your business. OH&S has been given the authority to administer tickets. So this will be on-the-spot tickets that OH&S can issue in the workplace. If you were to get a ticket, you could plead guilty and make the volunteer payment or go to court. And our understanding is that will be very similar to traffic court, where you have the opportunity to plead guilty and make the volunteer payment, or plead not guilty and appear in court. This legislation for the summary offense tickets has passed in Saskatchewan, but there is still an educational period before the first tickets will be issued. Once these tickets are issued, they will be for employers, owners, supervisors, workers, and contractors. Anyone in those parties can be ticketed under the summary offense ticket. This webinar will go through and itemize the list of fines with the infractions and give you a list of what is coming with this new legislation and how you can prepare yourself and how this affects you in your workplace.
But how are these tickets going to be determined? OH&S is going to use what's called the Workplace Responsibility System. So with that, OH&S looks at, within the business, who has the greatest degree of responsibility and control. So for example, if a worker is not wearing their seatbelt and the employer never told the worker to be wearing the seatbelt, then the employer would be looking at getting a ticket for that infraction. However, if the employer trained that worker on forklift safety and forklift operation and has a record that they've provided this training and the employee has participated in this training, well then it should be the employee's responsibility that he's not wearing the seatbelt and could in fact get that ticket. So there's a degree of workplace responsibility in determining who in fact gets ticketed at the workplace. There's 71 different offenses which cover 38 sections of the Act and regulations, but not all of these offenses are applicable to Motor Safety Association members. Some are applicable to healthcare, some may be applicable to oil and gas and construction. So we touch on the ones that are applicable to our members. Throughout the presentation, you may see some of the items highlighted in yellow. Those ones are not listed as something that is applicable to the dealerships and the members of MSA, but just keep in mind that perhaps you could have a ticket from one of those infractions, but just from the designation that we were given, it just kind of lists the categories. So just generally the ones that we have talked about and that'll be highlighted in black will be the ones to be aware of, but I just want you to understand that there are some other infractions available and that anything is essentially possible. We just want you to be aware of what's presented in this presentation today. So with that, Saskatchewan now joins 7 other provinces in this jurisdiction in Canada that will soon have or currently have on-the-spot occupational health and safety penalties and fines. So that's kind of where the presentation lies today, in itemizing these fines and giving you guys a bit of an amount and an idea of how the process works. So what kind of amounts are we talking about? This essentially is just a guideline of the summary offense ticket amounts. For workers, their tickets would be around the $250 mark. Supervisors, $400. Managers, $600. And employers and owners, $1,000. Keep in mind, this is for each infraction or contravention or compliance order. So if OH&S comes in, they may not give you just one ticket or one item. There may be a series of things when they're at the dealership. So these numbers could significantly multiply depending on what OH&S finds at your dealership. So with that, we'll get started into the meat and potatoes of the presentation, and I'll give you some information. So Act 14, failing to develop and implement a written violence policy statement. So you need a violence policy statement at your dealership, and with that you want to include a plan for prevention, how you're going to prevent the violence by having a plan in place to prevent it. So if you don't have that, that's going to cost you $600. Failing to establish a committee as required by the Act, that falls under Act number 15, and that's a $400 infraction. So if you have 10 or more workers in your workplace, you need to have a safety committee. Half of those must represent workers, and you need to have at least 2 to 12 people on your safety committee. So keep that in mind if you don't have a committee and you're currently in the process of setting up your committee. And you're going to want to get committee training for the members in your committee. Act 35B, failing to submit a written progress report. So if OH&S were to give you a compliance order or notice of contravention, on that there will be a due date. So if that due date is listed on there, you would have 5 days after that due date to get back to OH&S with your progress report as to what you have completed and what's in progress. Hopefully everything's completed by that time, but it is a progress report. So if you don't get back to them within that time frame, the applicable fines are listed there on the slide. How about Act 57C, failing to comply with any requirement or contravening any prohibition imposed? For example, if occupational health and safety gave you a contravention or compliance order and you didn't comply with it, and they didn't initially ticket you on an item, well, now that you are aware of it, they can ticket you on these items if they didn't ticket you in the first place. Say, for example, if they wrote you up for not doing daily or pre-trip inspections on your cranes or your powered mobile equipment, and they come back to your workplace and you still aren't doing that, well, all these parties will now get that applicable fine because you guys are all aware of it because they were in there, they explained it to you, they wrote you up on it, and you had fair due chance and warning to comply with the contravention. So if you don't, the fines will be leveled across the dealership if those people are in fact in contravention of the Act for that particular task, if they operated that crane without doing a pre-trip inspection. How about obstructing an officer? So if an OH&S officer wants to come into your dealership and you're standing at the door blocking them, not letting them to enter your facility, well, you could get a fine accordingly for that as well. How about under Act 73, failing to submit information requested by the director? So if the director of Saskatchewan Occupational Health and Safety wants information from you, for example, they may want to see, if they were at your dealership, they may want to see what kind of action plan you have or the goals to remedy with a contravention or compliance order. So if you don't provide information requested by the director, this is what you would be fined for accordingly for that infraction. As you can see, the next slide or the next item is in yellow, which is one that's not applicable to your industry, but even though it's listed for another industry, it's still something you should be aware of, failing to give notice of new work operations. So if you are starting a new business, you'd want to notify OH&S so you can set up your committee and you can register in Saskatchewan with your WCB number also. How about now from the Act, we've jumped over to the regulations, and Regulation 7.2, failing to give notice to begin a high-risk asbestos process within the specified time. So if you're going to be working with asbestos in your dealership, you're going to want to notify OH&S at least 14 days before you begin the asbestos process. So you're going to want to have that information for occupational health and safety. Regulation 8.1, failing to give notice to the Occupational Health and Safety Division of any incident as specified. So at your location, if there was an incident that caused or may have caused the death to a worker or someone to be hospitalized for 72 hours or more, you're going to want to report that to Occupational Health and Safety. It's very good information for them to have, so you could present that to them, that this incident has happened. And if the person had went to the doctor, they're going to find out about that information anyway. So you may as well be forthcoming, let them know of the incident that took place. How about Regulation 9.2, failing to give notice to the division of any dangerous occurrence as specified. So this is if something happened, but there may not have been an injury. For example, if a grinder wheel burst or if a scaffold collapsed. So something like that would be a dangerous occurrence that happened. Nobody was hurt, but they had potential to be hurt. Again, that's something that you're going to want to communicate and notify to OH&S. If you don't, and they find out about it, you could be fined a $600 fine. Next one, failing to ensure that a person under the age of 16 years is non-employed or permitted to work on a work site as specified. So when we refer into the Act and regulations, under Regulation 14, it lists workplaces that people under the age of 16 cannot be employed in, or tasks that they can't be doing. Some of those tasks are they can't be operating an overhead crane, a hoist, or a piece of powered mobile equipment like a forklift. So in your store, those might be tasks that you have in place. So keep in mind, if you have someone that's younger than 16, they cannot be doing that. That's also applicable in that same regulation if there's a chance where the exposure to a chemical or biological substance is likely to endanger the health or safety of the person. So that could be in an auto body shop. Perhaps you can't have somebody working with chemicals in your auto body shop painting cars if they're under 16 years of age. So for more information, refer to Regulation 14.1, which kind of gives you a little bit more to go with on that as well. How about failing to ensure that a person under the age of 18 years is non-employed or permitted to work on a work site as specified, Regulation 14.2. That'll get you a $1,000 fine. Some of those some of those work sites for an 18-year-old or under would be in the mines or radiation or an asbestos worker. So again, you would want to refer to Regulation 14.2 for more information on some of those items. How about this one here? This one's kind of a catch-all for the supervisors. Supervisor failing to ensure workers comply with the Act or regulations. So as a supervisor, I'm supposed to know the Act and regulations which are applicable to the workers that I'm supervising. So I'm not saying you have to know the complete Act and regulations, but you're going to want to know how to find the information in it, and you're going to want to know what your responsibilities are for the workers you're supervising and the legislation in there that's applicable to the workers that you're supervising. If you don't, and as a supervisor, you could be fined $400 for each of the infractions that may occur or that have occurred at your location under your responsibility as a supervisor. Regulation 54, failing to provide first aid personnel and supplies. So as a employer, I have to provide first aid personnel and supplies, but in the back of the regulations, it's called Table 9. So depending on the business, you're going to need a certain amount of first aid supplies and a certain level of training. So it's dependent on your staff level and how close you are to the nearest medical facility. So refer back to Table 9 at the end of the regulations to give you more information onto what your requirements are at your location. Regulation 54, failing to ensure first aid personnel are qualified. Again, this would be tables 1 through 3 in the back of the regulation. This talks about your guidelines for the personnel for first aid. So it may say you may need a CPR level C or CPR B depending on what's listed in those tables. So you would refer back into there to see what's applicable for your location. Regulation 67-2. Failure to inspect, clean, or maintain the ventilation system at an appropriate frequency. So what is an appropriate frequency? A lot of this would be applicable to the original manufacturer and what it says in the operations or service manual. If it says every 6 months you're supposed to maintain, or every year to maintain your ventilation system and clean it, so that's what you would do. And it ties into the next regulation, 67.4. When you do these maintenance and cleaning, it's to be done by someone competent with proper knowledge of what they're doing, and you're supposed to keep a written record of these inspections and maintenance that you've done for your ventilation system. So these records need to be available, and if your Occupational Health and Safety Committee requests it, the employer has to provide it to the committee, or if the Health and Safety Division wishes to see a copy, the employer would have to provide that information as well. So as an employer, you're going to want to look and see what your duration is and how often you're supposed to service the ventilation systems, and just keep records of what you have done with those ventilation systems in case you're ever requested for it, and just to have it inspected and cleaned as per the appropriate frequency. Regulation 87.1a, failing to provide personal protective equipment. And this is where the employer is to provide personal protective equipment to the worker at no cost. So that's when we're looking at the worker providing PPE such as eye protection, hearing protection to the employer or to the employee, and that's going to be dependent on the risk level in their workplace. So depending on the risk level, there may be more PPE required. So then it's also the employer's responsibility to ensure that workers are using the personal protective equipment. So keep in mind earlier when I talked about the workplace responsibility system. So if I'm the employer and I've told the person to wear personal protective equipment, and I've provided the personal protective equipment, and I've trained the worker and orientated them on what their requirements are, that should be the worker's ticket, which you would see next in 87.4a. So if the worker isn't using that required personal protective equipment, they would get the $250 fine. Or the flip side of that is if you didn't supply it and you have no documentation or records that you provided any training or orientation to that worker on the correct use of PPE, then that could in fact be the employer's ticket. So you're going to want to spend some time with a good orientation or have some sort of training that lets the workers know that their requirements are to wear the personal protective equipment, because there's applicable fines for everybody with when it comes to personal protective equipment. Regulation 116.2a. Failing to ensure that workers use a fall protection system where a worker may fall 3 meters or more. So when we look at some of these locations, what's 3 meters or more? Well, in a farm dealership, that could be the top of a combine, or in a heavy truck dealership, it could be the top on the cab of some of these tractor trailers and some of the cabs that are involved in those dealerships, or a mezzanine level that's 3 meters or more in height. So you're going to want to have some sort of a fall protection system in place, whether it be a barrier, fall arrest harness, some sort of a system to protect the worker. Same thing applicable for 116.2b. But with this regulation, this one gets down to specifics. If the person's at the danger of falling from 1.2 meters to 3 meters, in that gap, if they have the distance or the potential of falling from that area, there could be a fine in place also. So when we look at some of the locations out there, what is that 1.2 meter to 3 meter area? Well, I was at a farm dealership yesterday and we looked at their loading dock and they were over that 1.2 meter in height. So there would be an example of where the employer should have some sort of a barrier or a sign or some sort of railing when the loading dock's not in place so that people can't fall off the end of it. If not, there could be a $1,000 fine. This is also applicable, let's say, in some of the quick change lube bars where people are changing oil in drain pits. So there's another opportunity where you would need some sort of railing in place to prevent the worker from falling. So that would be another example of a fall protection system. These next couple regulations also pertain to the fall protection side of it, failing to develop a fall protection plan. The key word here is written. It needs to be a written plan. Your plan should describe the fall hazards, the rescue procedures, ensure that your staff are trained on how to use this plan. The next one, 116.1.3, failing to ensure that a copy of this plan is available before work begins on the work site. The key word here is before. So when you have this plan, it needs to be written and it has to be available before the work starts. Regulation 121, failing to ensure that handrails are equipped, constructed, and supported to the required standard. So what exactly is the required standard? When I refer back to Regulation 121, if it has 5 or more steps, you need a handrail that extends the entire length of the stairway, and it needs to be adequately secured, strong enough to support a worker. It has to be between a height of at least 32 to 36 inches in height and be at least constructed of 2x4 strength or greater. And when it comes to the upright beams for the handrails, they have to be at least no more than 3 meters apart. So that gives you some clear guidelines on how your handrails are to be equipped with. They're also supposed to have a toe board or kick plate that's 5 inches in height on the bottom as well. So I've seen people use 2x6s where they've strapped the bottom of their mezzanine with just to ensure that they have the correct height and it's a solid enough construction to prevent parts or items from falling down through that mezzanine. How about Regulation 124, failing to ensure that any opening or hole is covered or clearly marked? Well, an example would be if you have perhaps a tire chute where you drop tires from the second or from your mezzanine level or your upstairs down to your main level. So when you're dropping those down, you're going to want to have signage or some sort of a guardrail in place that people are going to be informed and aware of the hazard. Or in some cases we've seen in locations where they have a large open pit or an open hole in their floor where they may have used it as a jig for manufacturing or that they use it for a stand. But if you have a large hole, whether it be in a roof or on ground level, you're going to need to have a cover that's covering it. So if it's on the floor, it needs to be strong enough that you can drive over it, and you're going to want to have the applicable and appropriate signage in place to ensure that nobody falls through this opening or hole. Regulation 133.1, failing to provide or require the use of high visibility vests, armlets, or other high visibility clothing. So as an employer, if my employees are at risk of vehicular traffic, and that could be in pretty much any one of our membership businesses, if there's risks of vehicles that can come into contact with the worker, you need to have high visibility vests or armlets or some sort of reflective device. This is more commonly seen at gas bars or maybe car dealerships, but it could be in place anywhere essentially. I've seen farm dealerships where on the back of their coveralls they have high visibility reflective X's, and on the sleeves built right onto the coveralls. So they've because there is vehicular traffic in dealerships. There's trucks that are coming in. You are also going to be aware of speed limits on your lot, and if you have that posted, so that people understand the vehicular traffic and if there is a route for trucks to follow and customers. These next regulations in yellow pertain to traffic and construction. How about Regulation 133? Worker proceeding without clear view in absence of a signaler. So if I don't have a clear view of the powered mobile equipment I'm operating, I need someone to signal me in. And it doesn't matter if it's a small tractor or a large combine or a garden tractor. If my view is clearly obstructed, I need to have a signaler. Obviously, with the garden tractor, you would all have good visibility, but just keep in mind, the key words here are clear view. So I'd like to remember the example I've seen where an employee was backing up a combine without someone signaling him, and he banged the unloading auger into another combine's unloading auger. So that's not a good thing to happen on September long weekend during harvest and have two combines down. So you need to have the signaler in place, or you will, as a worker, get a $250 ticket for driving without a signaler guiding you when you don't have a clear view. How about Regulation 137.1? Failing to provide an effective safeguard as required. So a safeguard could be something similar to on a shop press, that you would have a press guard or a press curtain, or your angle grinders, the appropriate shielding and safeguards. So you're going to want to ensure that those things are in place on the equipment and tooling that you have in your dealership. Otherwise, you can be fined $1,000 for each of those infractions. And then the same, right in the next regulation, 137.2 ties into that, failing to ensure it remains in place. So if this stuff gets removed, there's quite a few fines that are applicable to that, failing to provide it, and if someone removes it. So it could be a pretty expensive day if you get a fine for not having the appropriate guarding or shielding on your tools. How about Regulation 139, failing to lock out a machine? And to lock out a machine just means to basically stop it from being able to move or power up or energize. For example, some methods of locking out a piece of powered mobile equipment is to disconnect the battery, remove the key. I've seen people where they removed the key and took a padlock and locked it to the steering wheel so no one can start that piece of equipment until they get the key off the steering wheel. Or they had signage in place on the steering wheel or the ignition area or on the door of the cab saying that, machine in service, do not start. There's a lot of suppliers that offer lockout signage and lockout tags. So just to keep in mind, that's a regulation that you're supposed to ensure that you're completing. Or I've seen an example of someone's in the engine compartment of a large piece of equipment, and that piece of equipment's parked in the doorway, and someone else decides that they're going to start it up and move it. Well, you got somebody that's in this engine compartment and people weren't aware of it. So that's the very important aspect of lockout, tagout. Regulation 139, failing to ensure an energy source has been isolated and residual energy dissipated. So that's just ensuring that if you're working with electrical energy, that it's turned off and there's no residual electrical energy left in the wires or the area in discussion. Regulation 158, failing to ensure operator uses seatbelt or other restraining devices as required. That's an $800 fine. So the employer, again, needs to ensure that the operator of the powered mobile equipment is using seat belts or the other restraining devices. Regulation 192, failing to ensure or obtain certificate that an aerial device, elevating work platform, or personnel lifting unit is designed, constructed, erected, operated, and maintained. So essentially, our interpretation on this regulation is they're referring to home-built man baskets, that kind of thing for lifting personnel. So those things, in fact, need to be engineered and certified. They can't be a home-built pallet or something you welded up at your store. Regulation 231(1)B, failing to ensure that a sling and sling's fittings and attachments are suitable for and capable of supporting the load being hoisted. So if you're using slings and rigging, you're going to want to know the capacity of your sling. It should be labeled right on the sling. If it's not, discard that sling because it needs to be on there. You also want to know the weight of the object you're lifting and use the proper rigging arrangement. And ensure that you're not using damaged slings and rigging when you're hoisting and moving items. So it's a critical thing to be aware of, the slings, the rigging you're using, and the weight of the object you're lifting. Regulation 253, failing to ensure that a portable ladder in use by a worker is secured against accidental movement. So when I refer back to Regulation 253, you're going to want to ensure that that ladder is secured, whether it be tied off somehow on the top, or if you're in a wood environment, nailed or secured on the bottom. Failing to do that could cost you an $800 fine as well. Regulation 272(1), failing to develop a written hazardous confined space entry plan. So when we talk about what exactly is a confined space, well, confined space can be defined as something that has one entrance and exit point. Can you think of something like that at your location? Well, some examples that we're aware of would be a bulk fuel tank or an oil storage tank, an air cart at a farm dealership, or a sprayer tank. Those things would be classified as a confined space. So you need some sort of a confined space entry plan, and your plan must be in writing according to Regulation 272(2). And some examples in your plan that you're going to want to address are oxygen deficiency, hazard ID, rescue planning, ventilation, and having staff trained on your hazardous confined space entry plan. Regulation 272(3), failing to implement a hazardous confined space plan. So if you have these hazards applicable, you need to have this entry plan implemented. And you need to ensure that your workers are trained for this confined space and the rescue portion of the rescue plan. So that's something that you need to be aware of, how the plan is implemented. Regulation 272(4), failing to post the entry plan at the entrance of the confined space. That's self-explanatory. That's a $600 infraction. Regulation 321(1), failing to ensure workplace labels with the specified content are used as required. So this refers to WMS. And if you take a product out of its original bottle and you pour it into a decanted bottle, and you don't have the supplier label on it identifying what the product was, you just put into this unmarked jug, well, that could cost $400. Regulation 334.1, failing to identify excuse me, and keep a written record of specified asbestos-containing materials. And that could cost you $1,000. So if you built this building, so you would have reasonably known of asbestos, if any in that building. So you would need to keep a written record of that. So if you know of or reasonably should have known of asbestos, you need to identify and retain that record and keep that information. These next three regulations also pertain to asbestos, and basically if you are working with it, I'd recommend contacting an asbestos specialist, because there's a lot of procedures that are involved with asbestos that you would need to be aware of. But to give you a little information on it, as per the regulations, in Regulation 337.1, failing to develop and implement an asbestos control plan, that'll cost $1,000. So your plan needs to talk about how you're going to prevent the release of asbestos into the air. Failing to include required elements in the plan. So in your plan, you could refer back to the Regulation 337.2. It details what elements are required in your asbestos control plan, such as the emergency procedures, the protection of workers, and decontamination procedures. And failing to make the plan available to workers would cost you $600. So there's a few fines just pertinent to asbestos that is an area that sometimes people may not pay attention to, but in light of these regulations, it's one that they find of great importance, as you can see by the applicable fines. How about Regulation 361B? Failing to develop and implement a fire safety plan. Well, that'll cost you $400. And a fire safety plan needs to talk about preventing the outbreak of fire, and needs to be a written plan talking about how you'd sound the alarm, evacuation procedures, storage of flammable products, etc. Those would be some of the required elements as listed in Regulation 362 that I just spoke of. Those need to be included in your fire safety plan, or it's going to cost you $400. 363B, failing to ensure the plan is posted, and ensuring that you do at least one fire drill every 12-month period and keep it documented. So you need to have your evacuation plan posted and your documentation of your fire drills every 12 months that they're taking place, at least in your dealership. As you can see, there's $1,600, referring back to the previous slide, $1,600 of fines just pertinent to fire planning and fire drills. So that's something that you're going to want to pay close attention to. I've spoken to some local fire departments, and some of those groups, they can help your stores with that, where they'd like to know where the explosive or the compressed cylinders are in your location, or your flammable chemicals and explosive products. So those are some examples of where those people can work with you and help you on these infractions pertaining to fire. These next ones are not applicable to you folks. Regulation 465.3, failing to ensure that a non-electrical worker maintains a minimum safe distance from an exposed energized electrical conductor. So if I'm a non-electrical worker and my employer asks me to, hey, can you service this electrical panel and I need you to change out this wire, I'm going to probably utilize my right to refuse on that if I'm a non-electrical worker. But for the sake of this regulation, at the back of the regulations. Table 22 refers to the safe distance and the voltage that non-electrical workers can be in arrangement in proximity to an energized electrical conductor. So you're going to want to refer to that information in Table 22 in the back of the health and safety regulations. So with that, basically sums up the Motor Safety Association's interpretation of the Saskatchewan Health and Safety Amendment on the summary offense tickets. For more information, you could contact us at 306-721-0688 or refer to our website info@motorsafety.ca, or you can call the Saskatchewan Occupational Health and Safety Division, also known as Labor Relations and Workplace Safety, at the number listed below, 306-787-4496, and they can give you more information as far as interpretation on the legislation. So with that, I thank you for your interest in our webinar today.